So we've been talking about Hurricane Florence for several days now. You probably have heard a lot about the storm, and so we wanted to give you our latest thoughts and insight into what we're seeing here at the National Weather Service. You can see from the satellite image the storm is getting closer to the southeast U.S. coast. A very nice, well-defined, strong, intense hurricane. And as of this morning, the National Hurricane Center has raised some headlines, tropical headlines. So we have a hurricane watch and a storm surge watch in effect for portions of the central South Carolina coast, pretty much down to around Edisto Beach. And that's the current scenario. But things are still fluid and can change, and so we're still continuing to monitor the situation. So as of the latest advisory from the National Hurricane Center, at 2 p.m. we're looking still at a Category 4 storm, 130-mile-an-hour winds. The storm is located roughly 900 miles east-southeast of Charleston. So still quite a ways away, and that is going to come into play potentially as far as what we can expect as we go out into the next several days of the forecast. There's still some wiggle room here in the forecast. The movement has been to the west, northwest. Currently it's at fairly a good pace at 17 miles an hour. But as we go ahead and look at the forecast, there's going to be some changes to that as well. And the pressure is down to around 950 millibars, or 28.06 inches of mercury. So here is the latest forecast cone graphic from the National Hurricane Center. As you can see, the storm as of 11 a.m. Was located in this position, well north and east of the Bahamas, pretty much to the south of Point on the map. There's a large area of impacts, especially those tropical storm force winds. The hurricane force winds are closer to the center. Now, as we go out in time, you can see the forecast takes the storm generally to the northwest and towards the southeast U.S. coast over the next several days. Some things we want to reiterate is area of possible impacts. As we've been trying to stress over the last several days, we don't want you to focus on the exact track of the storm. The storm has a large size, and it's expected to have a large trends of the forecast. Over the last few days, you probably noticed the storm generally trending a little bit more to the north, but we're still wanting to focus on the potential of the storm still tracking more on the southern end of that forecast cone. And technically that storm could track outside of the forecast cone. And so, again, it's not an area of impact. So don't focus on the exact track at this point. There's still a lot of uncertainty. The other thing we wanted to point out at this point was, as the storm gets closer to the coast, these positions get closer together. And what that essentially means is that the storm is expected to slow down. There's a lot of uncertainty in the forecast, especially as it gets closer to the coast and then potentially meanders around the coast through the weekend, maybe even into early next week. So we're continuing to monitor the situation, obviously, and work with the National Hurricane Center to try to bring you the best forecast that we can. So by the time we get to the end of the weekend, the storm could technically be anywhere from the mid-Atlantic down into Georgia and even outside of that cone. So again, there's a lot of uncertainty here, and we want to reiterate that point. So as far as impacts, of course, you know everybody's concerned about what might happen. Well, we really need to focus on the potential that a major hurricane landfall could impact the South Carolina coast. Okay, even though the chances in the southeast portion of the state might be relatively low overall, it's still a distinct possibility. And you probably have seen the officials ordering the evacuations and all that, starting the preparations. This is this very serious situation. When you're dealing with a storm of this size and magnitude, we just don't want to be fooling around. We want to really limit, loss of life and property damage. So I know it can be inconvenient for folks, but we're really trying to focus on that potential. And there's still a potential for that to occur. So there's potential for high to extreme impacts as far as winds, storm surge, flooding, rain, tornadoes, and dangerous marine and surf conditions. And in general, the greatest threats are to areas in South Carolina, which is more likely to see the direct landfall, or at least the center of the storm, come close to that area. Now, as far as timing for tropical storm force winds, we'll go ahead and take a look at that here in the next slide. This is our threats and impacts graphics. Now that we are under tropical headlines, we have a hurricane watch for part of the area, a storm surge watch. We issue these graphics to try to give everybody an idea of what they should be preparing for and the threat level. So in this situation, we're looking at a lower end threat for most of southeast Georgia up to around Charleston, and then points north of there, they're under a higher threat level. And then especially as you get farther up the coast. Now this is fluid. We're continually updating this with the latest information and forecast from the National Hurricane Center. It takes into account the forecast uncertainty. So continue to monitor these after every normal update from the Hurricane Center, which is 5 a.m. and 5 p.m. as well as 11 a.m. and 11 p.m. So the next update will be coming out here at 5 p.m. Again, the maximum winds, we could be talking about hurricane force winds, potentially category 4 type of wind speeds, which would be over 130 miles an hour. And that doesn't even include higher wind gusts, higher than that. So obviously a very serious situation. We're certainly hoping that doesn't happen for us or even for anybody along the coast, but the chances of the coast totally escaping the storm is looking very, very small at this point. So again, for the timing, it looks like tropical storm force winds, so that would be around 40 miles an hour or greater, possibly as early as late Wednesday night, late tomorrow night, into Thursday morning. Most likely, though, those would start on Thursday. And then hurricane force winds potentially could be Thursday or Thursday night. And as far as the impacts, if we're on the lower threat, we'd be looking at some trees and structure damage, relatively minor, some possible power outages. But of course, extreme impacts are certainly possible with widespread damage and widespread power outages. Again, this is just a graphic from the Hurricane Center showing the probability for tropical storm force winds and when those winds could arrive. And again, this is valuable information because the time that the tropical storm force winds arrive are when all preparations should be completed. So the earliest reasonable time of arrival along the South Carolina coast would be Wednesday night into early Thursday, and then a little bit later as you head on farther to the west. Now the most likely time of arrival would be pushed back a little bit later in the day on Thursday, closer to the coast, and then Thursday night farther inland. But as you can see, we also wanted to mention there's certainly a threat not along the immediate coast, but also well inland of seeing at least tropical storm force winds. Now, really the greatest risk, especially along the coast, is the storm surge. Essentially, mainly looking at low-lying tidal portions of central South Carolina, mainly from Edisto Beach to the north, although we already are seeing a little bit of storm surge and inundation just from the high tides, even a little bit farther down the coast over the last few days, just due to the astronomical influences. But as of right now, we're more likely to see in the areas where the storm surge watch is in effect, we could see life-threatening inundation of at least 3 feet or greater, but significantly higher values of inundation, that's water above the ground, could easily be 20 plus feet if we're facing a landfall of a major hurricane. The timing of the greatest threat of storm surge would be Thursday into Friday, and again, possibly extreme impacts. You know, if we see anything like 20 feet of water above the ground coming in from the ocean, obviously extreme impacts to any structures, and that doesn't even take into account large battering waves on top of that. And as you can see, our confidence in pretty much all these impacts is still low, on the low side. So we want to summarize, there's a lot of forecast, the confidence still remains low, and it's still too early to determine exact impacts for all the locations. Florence is forecast to remain a major Category 3 plus hurricane at landfall, most likely somewhere in North Carolina or South Carolina. The storm will likely slow down near landfall, and that's really not good news in terms of impacts, because that's really going to extend the impacts as far as storm surge, the winds, the flooding rain, and even the tornado. Florence is going to be a large storm with impacts well away from the coast, again, so we don't want you focusing on the exact track of the storm, as those impacts will be well away from the center. Potentially, when the storm slows down, it could actually meander around the coast and bring an extended period of impacts, depending on the exact track. It could even slow down and turn offshore again and then come back onshore. So we just don't know yet, and that's just the reality. We're continuing to monitor and certainly hoping for the best, but we want you to prepare for the worst. We need you to be prepared for potentially extreme impacts. Again, the highest threat of such conditions would be in South Carolina at this time. And again, we want you to listen to officials for advice as far as any advice they have regarding evacuations or things that you can do to prepare yourselves. So with that, we'll end it. We want to thank you for tuning in. We'll try to provide more updates throughout the coming days. We certainly hope the best for you and your families and your preparations, and we'll look forward to taking any questions and answering those questions after the broadcast. So thanks again for joining us.